Hello and welcome to Risk at Work, Risk Connect's educational web series. I'm Scott Fenstermaker. I'm the VP of Digital Marketing for Risk Connect. Today, we're going to be talking about positive risk management and its impact on business. You know, Nassim Taleb, author of The Black Swan, said at one point that we shouldn't even be studying risk management. We should be studying risk taking, because to simply stop our expertise having to do with downside risk only misses a large swath of expertise and information that provides benefit to our companies. We should be looking at the upside of risk as well as the downside of risk. 99 times out of 100, when we're met here together, we are here to discuss some version of the 11th commandment. Thou shalt not get taken by surprise. But today is going to be different. Today, we are talking about positive risk management. We're going to be asking questions like, how much risk should your company be taking? How do you know if you're taking enough risks? What are the opportunity costs about not taking enough risks? And what can you do to reposition yourself so that your company gets the full benefit of positive risk analysis as well as simple risk mitigation? And we have a wonderful speaker with us today who's going to be talking about just that. First of all, a couple of housekeeping items, as always. If you have questions for our guests, please put them in the appropriate field in the webinar software. And if we don't get to that question during the course of the webinar today, we will reach out to you directly with an answer from our guest. Also, if you indicated that you would like CPE credit for attending this presentation, keep an eye on your inbox after we're done today. You'll receive an email with a short quiz. You fill that out, you turn that back into us, and we will reply to you with your CPE credit. All right. I am thrilled to have back Dr. Ariane Chapelle. Ariane is an internationally recognized speaker, writer, and advisor having to do with operational risk management, as well as an associate professor at University College London. She is formerly the head of operational risk management at ING Group and Lloyd's Banking Group. Her consulting firm has received awards of excellence from Risk.net and SME Finance. Her best-known textbook, Operational Risk Management: Best Practices in the Financial Services Industry, was named Book of the Year in 2020 for Operational Risk by Risk.net. Her latest book is the reference material for GARP. She is the author of the GARP FRM 2023 textbook for operational risk and resilience. Obviously, we're thrilled to have such a heavy hitter with us today. It is my privilege to welcome back Ariane Chapelle. Ariane, how you doing?
I'm great. Thank you, Scott.
Like I said, we are thrilled to have you here. We can't wait to hear what you are going to be telling us today on positive risk management. What a great way and a great tone to start off 2023. So why don't you please take it away?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Scott, for your generous introduction. Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. I think it's still January, so I know it's still January, so still acceptable to wish you a wonderful new year. And to start off this year, we wanted to come up with a positive themes around risk management. And as a risk manager myself, and as having set up just a little bit of history, 20 years ago, I set up the operation risk management team for ING Southwest Europe, and I needed to gain buy-in into the discipline and to really get people excited and motivated in operational risk. And for you listening as operational risk professionals, I'm sure this is one of your core objectives, or one of your core concerns sometimes, is to make sure that people feel interested and involved in risk management. And so for that, I've developed this name of positive risk management that is around three elements. I like dividing concepts into three components, so this is no exception to the rule. And so I would like to guide you through these sessions around these three themes. First is recognizing that risk management is costly. It's either costly or effortful. Maybe I'll detail that later, but also recognize the opportunity costs of taking not enough or too much risk. So I'm going to detail this. This is the risk-taking decisions that Scott was alluding to. The second element is, yes, of course, you learn from your mistakes, but you can also learn from what went well and learning from your successes. And I'll guide you through a bit more details also on how you can use risk management information and use corporate informations to improve your feedback loop. And finally is, how do you position risk management to boost your performance? And more importantly, or more pragmatically, how do you measure? What are the sorts of metrics that can highlight whether or not your risk management is actually bringing value to the firm? And I'm sure you can agree with me that this is quite a common concern in many corporations. All right. So just to start with, also on the note, it's not only me saying that. COSO, which is the think tank network committee of publications and white papers in risk management, that has reviewed their enterprise risk management framework in 2018, and this is the last draft revision in 2017, and I like really this visual, so I kept it. And the ERM COSO framework is talking about aligning risk management with strategy and performance. And when you look at the graph, you could see that risk management is this target, if you want, or this concentric circle that support the strategy and objectives of organizations to deliver enhanced performance. So really, it's positioning risk management not about, or not only, definitely not only about avoiding things, but also wanting and reaching objectives and achieving your strategy. So just very quickly on this framework, you start with your mission and vision. So who are you? What's your role in the society? And where do you want to be in 10 years? And what are the core values that supports that? And from that, who you are as a corporate, also as a person, but let's take the institutions and corporation approach here. That gives you, that will highlight your strategy and more concretely your business objectives. And risk management, starting from the core of risk governance and risk culture, into risk appetite and risk strategy and priorities, and then executions of risk management, and then delivering of information. And I'll touch upon all these topics in some shape or form today. That will allow you to reach a better performance for organizations. So this doesn't only come from me, but this is really a trend that you see in the market over the last few years, is to position risk management in a proper way. So how do we optimize risk taking? How do we take enough mitigation measures, so not blowing up, but taking enough risk also to benefit for this uncertainty and the opportunities of the world? And a question that I've been mandated by a chairman of a risk committee of a North American sizable organizations, who asked me to audit their risk management and their risk information. He said to me, "Tell me how much money we are leaving on the table by not taking enough risk." And I thought it was a very refreshing view from this board member to say, all right, I understand risk management is important, and I understand you don't want to be reckless and explodes. But if you're not taking enough risks, and that's both financial and non-financial risk, we'll probably have a chance to discuss that as well. How much are we passing on? Okay. And so as you, in your function of operational risk management, talking to the business, I think recognizing that risk management is not reducing the risk as much as possible, but having this balance in risk taking and risk mitigation really helps your acceptance with the business and build a constructive dialogue about the role of the risk function. And it actually goes both ways, because looking at opportunity costs of excessive or under risk taking will highlight an area, extraordinary substance in your case for risk management. I'll explain. So if I take a simple parallel of the hidden part of the iceberg, if you're thinking of your cost of operational risk events, the immersed part of the iceberg is the visible direct loss. So typical example is you had disruptions in your ATMs, for instance, and there's a dissatisfaction of the clients, and you lose some transactions during the interruptions of the system. What you don't see is what a lot of firms are worried about is the reputation damage, okay? Is the negative referral, is the people saying, look, I'm not going to trade with that bank or with this asset management because their platform isn't reliable. Or if you have a problem with the customer service and your system doesn't adjust properly and your clients are not serviced the way they expect, how many will leave the firms? How many will talk to their friends and family of not joining the companies or not doing business with the company? And yes, it is very difficult to assess. And I also wrote papers on reputation management, but looking at the indirect cost, the client loss, the cost of remediations, the regulatory scrutiny because you've breached a compliance rule, this is all these indirect costs of operational losses. So that really can make the case of very important downsides of operational risk events. But conversely, if you have too many controls and you slow down customer service because for unrealistic reasons you cannot serve your customers, that's the bank blocking your transactions many times because they're so terrified, and I have a particular name in mind, but I won't mention anyone, I promise you, because they're so afraid of frauds that they're leaking customers out to other banks who are maybe taking more risks in terms of fraudulent transactions, but also offering a lot better and lot faster service to their customers. This is really important to measure as well. And so what you want as a risk manager is you want to put this dial properly, and the cost of inefficiency with this parallel of Starbucks that could take 10 minutes to brew a coffee, or Disney who would load very, very slowly people on the Peter Pan ride. Mind you, for those of you who have kids, you know the Peter Pan ride is usually one of the worst in the park. But double the ride and you start leaking out people out of your park so fast. Speed and efficiency and quality of service is very important, obviously, for the performance of the firm. So you want to have an idea of where lies your opportunity cost if you're not cheaper, faster, or better.
Ariane, I want to jump in on that and kind of highlight something and ask a question, because that's a very important point, and I think that that's something that our GRC audience is not really used to thinking of in that way. We typically taught to think that there are certain classes of risks, and certain classes of risks you just try to mitigate as fully as your budget will let you, right? And that those are distinct from other risks that are strategic in nature and might have an upside, right? So I think you and I talked about IT risk before when we were setting up this, and I said, well, I said stupidly that IT risk is one of those things that as long as you have budget, keep throwing it at mitigations for IT risk, and you were like, well, no, it's theoretically possible to slow down computers to the point where you can no longer get any work done. And that I had to get my brain around that a second, because it wasn't how I was used to thinking. That kind of sets up to me a kind of a curve nature, or maybe like a supply and demand curve, where on one side you have a reflection of the costs that are controlled by mitigation, and on the other side you have inconveniences or opportunity costs that you are experiencing as a result of your controls, and they would connect somewhere, and that would kind of be an optimal way to judge how much risk you should be taking. Can you reflect a little bit on that, on the balance of how much risk you should be taking, and where we might be thinking about this incorrectly as operational risk managers?
Yes, no, absolutely. I completely agree, and the way you describe it is, I think works absolutely. So it all depends on the cost versus benefits of your controls. So, and a concept that I found around risk appetite was I found interesting, and rather than talking about risk appetite, it was a journal in Australia. They were talking about appetite for controls. So if you talk about data security, yeah, people don't want to lose data on their phone. But, do you never log on to a free network? Do you always use your VPN? How much inconvenience are you ready to put up with? When you leave your house, do you put the shutters down every time? Or do you leave it, accessible that your window could be broken into? And so it's the same for IT and cybersecurity. Some banks I know have put very, very strict security on the accidental sending of emails on Outlook, because the Outlook autofill is the recipe for sending the wrong email to the wrong person. And so you have gradual, do you click when you have an external sender? Do you click when you have an external sender and attachment? Do you have a restricted list? Do you disable the Outlook autofill? I know a handful of banks who have done that, but then you have to retype the address every time. So how much of a drag do you allow, and how much of a loss in productivity do you allow to have when you have 100,000 people or 200,000 people every day have to retype all the external email sender, or even internal email sender if you choose to? And is that worth the cost of the potential wrong email sending once in a while? And so you can really see the benefit or the return of operational risk. That's definitely how I see it, as the avoidance of the cost of controls. Because you can bring down operational risk to zero, but then you probably bring down your business operations to zero as well, and that's going to cost you
Sure.
your entire turnover. So being conscious and being also sympathetic as a risk manager, if you are sympathetic to the cost of controls in the business, you have a lot of more feedback and buy-in and attentive ear and productive dialogue, I think. And originally I based these approach in these presentations for risk managers who have to go to the business. And if you're saying, well, look, I know it's a drag, but for the really important risk, we need to do this and this and this. And for the rest, I'll leave you alone. Believe me, I've experienced that several times. It works. You have a lot more positive feedback.
Great. Thank you.
Good. And so on the note, there is substance to it. It's not only me deciding or throwing out ideas on risk management. If you look at the facts, so if you look at years of data collections, we're talking about, this is the summary of 6 years of data between 2014 and 2020. When was the last published report of this granularity by ORX? So ORX is a data consortium that has over 100 members of large banks and large insurance companies. So we're talking about representative data sample. How you read this? Well, if you look at on more than 500,000 data points of internal loss in the financial services, you see that the loss reported in the smaller bin, the smaller severity category to ORX, which are already sizable on the scale of individual institutions. So between 20 and 50,000 euros loss. So about at par to the dollar has massively appreciated, as you know, against every currency. So you can look at that roughly as dollar parity. That's 60%, close to around 58, 60% of the occurrence. So a vast majority of the loss reported to ORX are in the smallest bin category. But when you look at their representations in terms of the total severity across all the categories, we are below 5%, okay? Less than a 20th of the total of what you lose is represented by 60% of your losses. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, the 0.4% in the 10 million plus that also has very, very large events, there's also 10 billion plus here. When you look at the largest banks, they represents 2/3 of the total severity. And if you as risk managers in your organizations haven't done these stats for your internal loss data, I absolutely encourage you to do the same. And I promise you that you will find the similar proportions. This sort of very large dichotomy between very small and very frequent and very large and very infrequent. And I've presented these slides and these previous ones because these statistics are very, very stable over time. I've been monitoring them for the last 20 years and they haven't changed, largely not changed. They changed at the margin. And when I ask firms, where do you put your attention? Do you put your attention on the small ones more than on the large one? 100% of them says yes, absolutely. And you quoted Taleb Scott, and we both are, avid reader of his thought-provoking books. He's talking about controlling daily volatility. You don't want to control daily volatility because it's easiest, more visible, but it's also completely counterproductive, largely. Now, I need to caveat that a little bit, is where these small losses are important, but that's going to be for maybe another webinar when we talk about tail risk, is where these small losses are a signal of very large losses to come. So that's what I would call uncapped risk. But anyway, long story short here is to recognize there is a trade-off between risk and return and between cost of control. So in credit risk and financial risk, you have the returns of credit and market. In operational risk, you have the return of efficiency and speed. And so based on that, I've put my favorite activities, one of my favorite activities is to cut concepts into chewable categories. Here, there's not 3, there's 4, although there's 3 bad and 1 good, so there's still 3. I would say you have the silly risk decision, silly, daring, chilly, and unbalanced. And a silly risk taking is when the cost of control is small, and yet the control is very effective, and you're slack, you're lazy, or you're neglectful or reckless, put it in the way you want, and you're facing a large downside with no real upside. And everyday life is not buckling your seatbelt. The professional equivalent would be to not lock your workstation when you go to lunch or whatever, or to leave, valuable items laying down on your deck, where you can lock it. Okay, you take a large risk for a very small cost of effective controls. Daring is, and this daring, and the next one is violating, but daring is almost the gambling activities. You have a very large upside, very large downside, but you have the attractiveness of this profit. Now, on the violations, it can be rogue trading, it can be cheating on your tax return because you avoid all your taxes, but if you be caught, good luck to you, or it can be speculative behavior. And again, the question is, do you understand what you're stepping into? Do you understand the risk you face? If the answer is yes, okay, well, then don't whine if things go wrong. But if things go well, that could be also some seed money and very speculative funds, etc. As long as you understand, that's fine. But it's definitely very high risk. And the other one is not to understand the cost of controls. Is that would be the idea of layering control over controls, where actually the cost of the control is bigger than the value avoided. And so what you're left with is basically the balance decisions where your cost of mitigation versus the benefits of the upside that you pass on by mitigating, but also the losses that you avoid. And My background actually before doing and before teaching and working in operational risk, I was working and teaching in financial risk management and portfolio management. And so for Premier years ago, I've put together this article talking about the risk return trade-off, not only for financial risk, but also for operational risk. And if you put on a risk return graph, picture, axis, the different types of risk taking, you have the silly is the worst, okay? You have a lot of risk for no return that you avoid. Then you have the chilly when you have almost no risk, but also no return. I step short of putting the chilly actually under the horizontal axis. That would be the negative return. And that's the cost of non-doing. And an example, I just, I can't resist the temptation of giving that example because it's also familiar with a number of firms I work with. That would be postponing critical decisions because they're risky and or usually both effortful. An example would be replacing your core banking system. It's a massive drag, it's very risky, it's a huge project, lots of things can go wrong. But if you keep postponing and postponing, you're going to end up with legacy systems that do not work, and you're going to die a slow death because you didn't take risk. So the chili can actually have negative return, but I've been not too controversial on this. The daring, obviously, in a high, and so where you're at is this balance. And you recognize, for those of you who have a background in portfolio management, the efficiency frontier, when you have the optimum of risk taking and return.
So let me jump in and just ask really quickly. A lot of us who are going to be listening to this today, we will be coming from all sorts of industries, not necessarily just financial services. There's a very interesting idiosyncrasy to the financial services industry. Largely, we've been talking about strong controls and cost of controls and so forth, but financial services has an interesting attribute that you can take more risk strategically without having to change anything about your operation, right? If a bank wants to take more risk, you started this section off by asking somebody asking you, how much money am I losing or by not taking enough risk? What am I leaving on the table? And the calculus of that question is that if they wanted to take more risk, if that was the decision, they turn a dial, and the dial is just what interest rate they lend money out to, right? In operational risk and in other types of areas, as you well know, that doesn't necessarily apply. When you have to take more strategic risks, there's a lot more guesswork. A lot of the outcomes are much more in the tails. So my question to you is, how should we be thinking about extrapolating principles on greater risk taking, for example, that might come from the financial services industry, and think about those same principles in operational risk when in order to increase our risk, we got to take stuff that we're really kind of guessing about and might have much more outsized or outlier kind of effect?
Very very interesting questions, and also interestingly challenging as always, Scott. But so I think you can find examples and counterexamples on both. So in terms of turning the dial versus falling off a cliff. So actually, you didn't know that background of the story, I can testify. But this chairman of the board, the chairman of the risk committee who asked me the questions, what he had in mind was not operational risk taking, was credit risk taking. And his view of turning the dial without, revealing too much information was basically, what if we lend to more risky people? And more risky people and individual, that will increase the interest rates and this dial will turn. Now, this is true up to an extent, but then if you push it too far, you end up with the subprime or a subprime-like type of thing. So you end up with a risk that you think is there, but it actually is up there because it's not diversified, or because you're miscalculated, or because there's a common factor that you have misappreciated. So you can, and the same in market, you can take more market risk by being more risky on your mutual fund. And then you have the great financial crisis, and it's goodbye, everybody, at least for 10 years. And so you do have in financial risk as well, there's aspect of either big prices in market or in liquidity. You can have a liquidity cut, and you know, a lot of, the first bank in Belgium went bankrupt during the great financial crisis, not for credit risk, but for liquidity shortages. So you do have this fall off. Now, you say it's not only the financial services listening, and I'm very happy because that also brings me, I like the financial services, that's not what I mean, but one of my previous courses that I used to teach besides portfolio management was international finance. And international finance is essentially risk management for international companies. Now, of course, in terms of financial and FX exposure and international treasury, but it's also, you know, do I have to open a new factory in Mexico or in Paraguay, or how do I extend my businesses? And you have a lot of real risk management, i.e., like you have real options, so non-financial risk management, and it's essentially operational risk. So in non-financial firms, non-financial industries, all the risk taking are what we call operational risk in the financial industry. It's largely enterprise risk management. And there again, you can have these linear progressions or this fall of a cliff. So in my view, a more linear operational risk taking would be to have more customers, to have more employees serving more customers, to add a product, an additional product to your product line of 5 or 10.
Yes.
Okay. It's not exactly linear, but it's
a step change. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. A sort of a jump effect or non-linear aspects of operational risk would be to remove a key control. Like we were talking about IT, is to say, look, we had a two-factor, just to take a silly example, because who would do that, but you never know. And experience shows reality surpasses fiction. We're going to remove 2FAs. We're going to remove the two-factor authentication, and hocus pocus, the next day you have a massive attack, or your biggest customer is lost in a scam and in a fraud. So my point is, you can find examples of both. And I'll go back to one of the core message is you need to understand the drives of risk you take. So I said you need to understand the risk you're taking into. In order to understand the risk you're taking into, you need to understand the causes of the risk and these key controls. As soon as you have that, you can strike this balance.
Thank you.
Okay. Conscious of time.
I'll shut up now.
No, sorry, that's not what I meant. I should shorten my answer maybe, but so part 2 was a little bit of data analytics, simple cartoon-based data analytics, and learning from outliers. So again, it's not only me. Credit here to Sam Savage, who used to teach statistics at Stanford. Right, and had this book prefaced by Markovits. I'm always amazed by that. It's called The Flow of Averages, and he very kindly allows me to use his cartoon by Denzinger. Actually, he's a cartoonist in the US. And you see the quote here, classic example of the flow of averages, involves the statistician who drowned crossing a river that was on average 3 feet deep. So the point is, you don't average when you have a skewed distribution. A more gravulous, I'd say, versions of that is, on average, human beings have 1 breast and 1 testicle. The stats translations of that is you don't average binomial distribution. Okay, so if it's a 0, 1, it's 0.5 is always wrong. And so when you have very skewed distributions, like in operational risk, so most of the time you have little risk, and then once in a while you take a big bath, you don't average that because it makes no sense. And so if I relate that to what I've observed in firms over the years, and I'm sure many of you would relate to that, on the left-hand side of the slides, you see the reporting on average uptime per month, 99.7%. Actually, 0.3% of the time in a month is 130 minutes. So if you have a maximum downtime of over 2 hours, you still have an average uptime of 99.7, but that's probably won't be acceptable for most of you. So that makes no sense. Average sick days per staff, it hides the burnouts, it has the absenteeism, which in terms of KRIs can signal very, very different risk. Average customer complaints, where do they concentrate? Where are your best sales representative where all your customers are happy? What are your worst customer representative when most of your customers are unhappy? And this is these extremes that you want to highlight in operation risk. You have your maximum loss versus your massive losses, like I showed you in the graph. A true example also is a firm, a risk manager in a firm that says on average our third-party risk is yellow. Well, when you have weakest link and you have, red suppliers in your supply chain, doesn't really matter whether your average is green, yellow, or whatever other color. Okay, and so risk information, sadly, and especially in operational risk, which is also the one I know best in terms of reporting, are averages most of the time. And especially if you use key risk indicators, don't use averages, because you're gonna squish, you're gonna mix your extreme, and that's where the information lies. Your positive extremes, these are the positive outliers I want to refer to, and of course your negative outliers, these are your incidents and accidents. So whether it's for KRI or for losses or for other performance metrics, you want to use, learn from your best performance. And again, others have captured that and expressed that very, very well. And one of the essays that influenced me the most about 10, 12 years ago was Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, who has been, I think, a bit abusively or simplistically been summarized as a 10,000 hours. In order to be good in a discipline, you need to practice for 10,000 hours. There's a lot more, but it's around, so in each chapter, the author is looking at, how come Bill Gates became Bill Gates, how come Michael Jordan became Michael Jordan's, the Beatles became the Beatles, etc., by looking at what were the combinations of chance and skills and determinations and key behaviors that made them who they are. And it's very uplifting to go back to your success, and it's definitely more uplifting to reflect on your success than reflecting on your failure. And so my extension of that, or my interpretations of that in the area of risk management and operational risk management is, as a risk manager, instead of only looking at root cause analysis of incidents, why don't you look at root cause analysis of successes? I was in university, shall I say, in the late 80s, early 90s, but for those of you who are old enough to remember the 80s and 90s, it was very much around the success stories and what makes this company or this CEO or this joint venture particularly successful. And there was a thirst of learning from the best. And at the level of a firm as well, you can reflect on your success. So if you're familiar, and definitely for those of you who are not in the financial sector or familiar with ARM, with the bow tie analysis and the root cause analysis, you can do a bow tie analysis, you can do a 5 whys, a fishbone, or whatever reflections and post-analysis, not only on incidents, but also on success. And examples of that are all from personal experience, of a professional but individual experience I had firsthand, was companies that really pushed during a project with a very tight deadlines and managed to pull it off, process disruptions that was impacting retail customers that they managed to overcome without any complaints for their customers. Successful projects, we all have examples of projects failures, but when you have examples of projects that are on time, on budget, what was right, successful IT migrations, or even I had the clients who had a massive compliance breach and managed to handle it without a compliant fine. So these are worth being studied in detail.
I think just to make sure that you can get through your material without feeling rushed in any way, I think I'm going to hold questions probably for the end from this point forward. So please continue.
Okay. Sure. So just to close on this topic, but there is a practice of firms to reflect on incidents and how they managed incidents and what did they do well and what did they do not so well. And that's fine, and that's already very important. And if you do that, I'd say you're ahead of the pack, or you're in the first half. But what I would encourage you to do, because most firms I talk to say they don't do it enough, is to systematically reflect also on what worked well. And that's grosso modo the value of feedback. Feeding back this feedback loop, or this debriefing, which is a systematic practice in the military, for instance, is one of the crucial way to learn on what went well and what not so well. And so this is another key theme I'd like to insist on with you is, how do you know it works? How do you measure the value of your risk management? Actually, this question, how do you know it works, is one of the opening questions, for instance, in the first page of Douglas Hubbard, who has a decision-making and risk management consultancy in the US. Very interesting. He also works with Sam Savage, by the way. So, and I say this because there's not enough, I find, feedback loop in operational risk management, definitely in the financial services, that forces the firms to improve and reflect on the good and less good elements of their risk management. And so how do you position risk management positively is to have a clear view of what your aim is, what your goal is. Maintain the aim is a motto also in the military, and also recognizing that the more ambitious your goal is, the more important risk management is for you to achieve this goal. This is an example of, would be a marathon running or a speed run or whatever. If you're very ambitious, if you want to be the best in your field, you need to be very, very strict in maintaining your performance, your body, avoiding injuries, etc. But going back to my example of the core banking system, if you want to embark on this very important but also very complex project of replacing a core bank system, or acquiring a business, entering a joint ventures, developing in another country, these are important, profitable projects, but there's a million things that can go wrong. And so risk management is really, really important for you to maintain these objectives. And so how do you measure if operational risk, or if enterprise risk management more generally works? Well, if you are in a regulated industry, and in particular in the financial services industry, the minimum is regulatory compliance and capital reductions, or at least avoiding capital add-ons for the regulator, which is very important because capital is the most expensive source of funds. So financial companies and companies in general are very, very keen to reduce their funding needs in terms of equity. But more importantly, the value, and there's a large consensus of that, I'm sure you agree, the value of risk management comes into informing better decision-making at strategic, tactical, and operational risk, operations for the firm. So the most obvious one is reducing the losses, reducing the large losses, avoiding these big tail risk, and that will bring stability in your revenues, and avoiding insurance premium if you decide to insure this premium, and then improving general profitability by reducing these frequent losses if they are cost effective to reduce. And we're back to our discussions on on the cost of control. So that's the obvious one. That's the measuring the limitations of the downside. But I also really encourage you to do is to measure the impact of risk management on you capturing the upside. And so how is risk management improving your performance, improving your productivity? And so we're back to also what we discussed about IT. If you have controls that are just slowing you down for no benefit, you reduce these controls, you redesign your controls, that improves your productivity. But you can also, from a Six Sigma efficiency point of view, having what in the industry and in risk management for engineering, you call prevention through design, is you design the processes and you make it preventable without slowing a bulky process down, basically. And then finally, and I'd say the increasing role of importance, you have, how do you measure the quality of your decision making? Well, largely, I would say by looking if your performance is according to plan. So how many of your projects have actually not only been finalized, but have produced the synergies expected? Have your investments been as profitable and as wise and well informed as you should? Which is, in my observation, something that I dare to say almost never happens in operational risk, is looking at operational risk as an influencer of the quality of project selections and investment selections. Project risk management is now part of operational risk management, but not systematically. And so as part of this vision, I couldn't help myself to not give you this picture of Richard Feynman, who's been absolutely praised and well known for his capacity to explain in simple terms something as complex as theoretical physics. And he achieved that by a deep understanding of his field. And so that's the quote that captures that. If you cannot explain something in simple terms, you don't understand it. And I've been teaching for 30 years, and I absolutely relate to this quote. You cannot explain something that you do not fully understand. And so as a risk manager, if you have to explain the benefits of risk management to your audience, to the business, you really need to understand very much not only the business, but also the risk you're taking, and have a vision in terms of what you want to achieve, because it's only when you know what good looks like, or what success looks like in terms of good risk management, that you can measure if you have achieved these objectives. And so on that note, another quote from a CEO that mentioned that to me, and I thought that was very interesting. It's also interesting when CEO of large companies talk about risk management. And he said to me, risk management is about delivering the intentional, not the accidental. Okay, so you want to be, you want your performance to be intentional, not random, basically. Okay, and so just to leave room for discussions, I'll go quick on this table. It's also published on RiskNet, and you'll have access to the slides. But these are some examples of metrics. When people said to me, well, you can't measure what you're saying, it's a challenge I always take on, because I think you can always find proxies and metrics of what you want to measure. So these are examples of measurements you can use for business stability, profitability, success rates of projects, and success rates of investments. And so, look, just to finish on that, and that's a little bit of repetition of the previous slides, but I had so many times people said to me, you can't measure what you've avoided. I said, no, you actually can, because you can compare the before and after. So that's your trend before you've put risk management in place, after, when you've tried some things, and after. Compared to your peers, no news is good news. Firms that are out of the newspaper for the wrong reasons surely are doing something right, especially on the long term. You can be lucky for 3 months, but much less so for 3 years. And so in a bit more evidently, you can look at the robustness of your business outcome. So how much you've achieved your plans and your business objective. And if you have, year in, year out, surely you're doing something right in risk management. All right. And so just to conclude, I think risk managers who would be typically, and I oversimplify, and I definitely put me into that pack, people who are careful, cautious, sometimes risk averse, although I wouldn't qualify me as risk averse or risk avoidant, but definitely a bit more frightened and a bit more pessimistic than their business counterpart, realizing that you need these two sides of the coins. You need to do this temperament and understand the thrives of the business and the need for the business to be fast and thriving, can really find this balance between the optimist and the pessimist in the business to really fuel performance.
Thank you very much, Ariane. Your comments are wonderful. Your concepts are intriguing. I think we have time for one, maybe two questions here. But something that I really wanted to get into, because it's a fascination for me, has to do with kind of the last parts, the last 2 or 3 sections that you were talking about here, and that is the idea of learning from outliers, which we've had offline talks and we're both kind of fascinated by. So you said, yes, it's possible. And yes, it is possible, but it can also be fraught. The idea of learning from outliers, which are by definition data points, even positive ones, that are infrequent, right? There's a very famous book called Good to Great that got itself in a lot of trouble for bad statistics by studying outliers and then reaching conclusions and forgetting to take those principles that it derived and test it against entirely new data. And we found out that their conclusions were 100% survivorship bias, and their praise for companies like Circuit City was perhaps a little bit premature. But you have to have a lot of humility to learn from outliers, a lot of epistemological humility, because you're hypothesizing. You're saying, okay, this was a success. It looks like we did these things right, so we're going to do those things more and see if more of these data points emerge. Can you talk a little bit about how we can be more sure of that our learnings are more due to skill and not due to luck?
Okay. You mentioned book, I'll mention books.
Yep. Yep.
No, but and I'll answer. But two books that pop into mind: Influencer and Fooled by Randomness.
Yes.
All right. So on the and I'll answer in order of your questions. So you're talking about survival bias, or you could look at that in terms of indices in the FTSE 100. Look at this company, but of course, every time something dies, it's replaced by someone else. So you end up having a bias cohort. And yes, you can have that. You can have that when you have an external anecdotal evidence. Oh, look at Kodak, they're doing so great. Oh, no, not so great anymore. Okay.
Right.
But maybe they were doing something great when they were, when they were praised for it. But anyway.
Sure.
Two things. I say anecdotal and external. So when I say learning from outliers, I would say learn from outliers internally for you. So if you look at, I don't know, managers, if you look at, if you want to have a view of the motivations of people and what people are wanting to work for your firms, etc., at first you can look internally of what are my best managers doing compared to my not so good managers. What is the difference between my managers who have fantastic 360 reviews, no demissions or resignations within their teams, versus the ones that cannot hire? Okay, and is there a difference in these cohorts? And you don't have so much of a survivorship bias here, because you are comparing the bad cohort with the good cohort, if you will.
Right. You have
You're not picking,
control group, basically.
Oh, Mr. So-and-so, he's loved by his firm, his team, and I'm going to reproduce what he's doing because you see him in the FT or in the Economist or UK references in the New York Times, and the New York Times will pick, the Warren Buffetts of investments, or you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And so these called good and bad is what I wanted to say about the influencer. Some of you might be familiar with this book. So the influencer, the subtitle is The Power to Change Anything. It's by Patterson and al. There's 5 psychologists in the US that have published that. They have a company called Vital Smart. And what they do is that they observe and they start from key behaviors. So what are the key behaviors that will lead to a change? What are the key behaviors that will empower the objectives? So if it's to improve the quality of teachers, they compare thousands of good primary teachers versus thousands of bad primary teachers. And, I'll be short. And so they look at what is the difference, and I'll spare you the details, and you can look at that. It's a fantastic book. You might like it. You might love it, actually. And so one of the highlights was correct quickly and praise often. So correct quickly when you have small deviations, and praise often. Okay, this is what I wanted, I did reproduce in risk management, working with lots of firms. Is what is the key behaviors you want in terms of better risk management? And actually, people say, well, the equivalent of the metro: if you see something, say something. So
Right.
that's raise your hands, do your best and raise your hands. It's quickly alerting of mistakes. So my point is, you can avoid this when you look at very large cohorts, but you compare the good ones and the bad ones, which is probably what Good to Great failed to do, probably why Good to Great ran into trouble. And the fool by randomness, just quickly, is and so that's what Taleb wrote before the Black Swan, where he's talking about traders who had one successful years and think that, what they did was fantastic, and then push that, and it's less fantastic, and they lose their Ferrari, and that's the best case, or their house, and I should say wife, that's going to be terribly sexist, their husband the next year. But that's a sample of one. You don't extrapolate on a sample of one. If you do one thing great, don't necessarily generalize all the comments, but compare the good ones and bad ones. What I'm saying here is actually, and I love your challenge as always, Scott, is when risk management only look at bad mistakes, so you don't compare two cohorts, you don't have the survival bias, you basically have the death bias, the dying bias. You think that everything goes wrong, so you can rebalance it.
Fabulous answer. Thank you very much. We are coming up on our time together. I could probably ask a whole bunch more questions and your answers would be equally as fascinating. Unfortunately, we only have this little bit of time together today. But I want to thank you so much for bringing such wonderful and fascinating material, and helping challenge our processes and preconceived notions as to how we should be thinking about risks, and how holistically we should be thinking about operational risks. So, of course, thank you to my guest, Ariane Chapelle. Her book, Operational Risk Management, one more time, Operational Risk Management, Best Practices in the Financial Services Industry. And her latest book is the text for GARP FRM 2023. If you want to hear more of Dr. Chapelle, of course, the best way to do that is to go to riskconnect.com. Make sure you are receiving our newsletters. She's going to be back with us. We're going to be talking about operational resilience, right? And we're going to be talking about tail risks. And you are not going to want to miss either one of those talks. They're going to be fascinating. Once again, for CPE credit, if you suggested that you want CPE credit for attending this presentation, we will send you something. Watch your inbox for a note from us, fill that out, bring that back to us, and we will get you your credit. Thank you to all of us. Thank you to all of you for spending some time with us today. Thank you to my guest, Dr. Chapelle, and we will see you for the next Risk at Work. Take care.